Good evening, everyone. As Julie said, I'm Madhav Rajan. I'm the Dean of Chicago Booth and the George Schultz Professor of Accounting. I hope all of you are doing well. It's great to see so many of you here today. It truly is a pleasure to have all of you here as we welcome Booth alumna Jenny Scanlon of UL to our virtual Distinguished Speaker Series. The speaker series itself, of course, is a long tradition where we bring in leaders from business, from government, from the community, to the school to share their insights and experience. This virtual series is new, and actually I should thank Jenny. It was her idea that I think about doing something like this when we were speaking a couple of months ago, that this might be a great opportunity to bring in Booth alumni who are in leadership roles to talk about some of the issues and challenges they're facing with COVID and how they're reacting to it and how they think the world will change. So thank you very much, Jenny, for setting this up. So we began the virtual series a couple of weeks ago with Kurt Del Bene from Microsoft, and then we had Tom Ricketts from the owner of the Cubs last week, and we're thrilled to continue with Jenny today, and we'll have Byron Trott next week. So let me introduce Jenny. Jenny is President and CEO of UL. She has a deep commitment to science, technology, engineering, and math, and I think all of those shape her approach to advancing UL's leadership in driving confidence and trusting the next generation of innovation. Jenny became CEO in September. Prior to that, she was president and CEO of USG, which makes innovative building products. And she spent 16 years at USG, also serving as CIO and head of corporate strategy, and led the company through a major international expansion, completely transformed the role of technology in terms of transforming operational efficiency within USG, and also really, I think, put ahead her interest in developing sort of sustainable building materials. Before that, Jenny began her career at IBM. She holds degrees in government and computer applications from the University of Notre Dame, and of course, her MBA in finance and marketing from Chicago Booth. So we're thrilled to have Jenny here today. Jenny, thank you first for agreeing to do this event.
Thank you, Dean. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you.
No, I thought we would begin by just, if you could give an overview of your role at UL, and then we can expand into some of the issues that have happened with COVID.
Terrific. Well, I'll start with, I appreciate the deep introduction and background, and many of you don't realize that you actually have heard of UL and are surrounded by UL every single minute of every single day. And it is a privilege to lead a company of 14,000 employees around the world, dedicated to being the global safety science leader. We're a 126-year-old company, actually founded probably on the edge of the Midway in response during the World's Fair in 1893, in response to concerns about the way in which cutting-edge technologies were going to affect consumers. This came into sharp focus because of the electricity that was debuted at the World's Fair. And if you could picture 100,000 Edison light bulbs going on at the Columbian Exposition, our founder, William Henry Merrill, set up the first testing lab to test light bulbs, switches, and electrical and fire safety right there on the south side of Chicago. And we've expanded well beyond these focused beginnings around fire and life safety into a full set of services that every single one of you benefit from every day. We test, inspect, and certify products to keep you safe from the electromagnetic connectivity that probably each and every one of the cell phones or pieces of equipment that you're using to connect here, to new topics around environmental sustainability and governance. We're focused on cybersecurity, we're focused on battery safety and human factor safety, things that contribute to autonomous and electrical vehicles. And we are an essential service. We're focused on testing everything electrical, including medical devices. Now, it's interesting to be a new CEO, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the midst of a crisis. But prior to the crisis, my focus coming in was really on refreshing our strategy around driving sustainable, profitable growth and extending our global footprint beyond the 20 countries where we have offices and 140 markets where we serve. It's really an exciting time to be a global ambassador, although it's certainly a time that's even very different what's facing me than what I thought would be facing me when I was interviewing and considering taking this job last summer. But we've got a role to play as CEOs and as leaders. Our customers are looking to us for leadership in a crisis. Our employees are looking to us. Investors, lenders, suppliers, regulators, trade organizations, across the gamut, people are looking at the leaders of the world and expecting a response and a set of answers, and quite frankly, a set of comfort that there will be a new normal at some point. So I look forward to, having a discussion about not just the crisis, but leadership in general, and then taking questions.
Okay, thank you. So let me start. You had mentioned that you were 4 months into your job as CEO, and you got the first signs that something could be happening. What were those signs? How did you know something might be coming? And how have things sort of progressed for you from that point onward?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Being a global company and having, half of our employees outside of North America, one of the jobs as a CEO is you've got to travel around the world and just meet everybody. And I'm a big believer that, managing through Zoom and phone calls, as nice as that is for a few days, you really learn by being on the ground and seeing things. So one of the interesting cultural aspects of UL is that in advance of the Lunar New Year, we host annual dinners for all employees across our greater China region in each city. So I traveled to Taiwan and visited the labs in Taipei. And interestingly, on the night of January 16th, I toasted individually 750 people, clinked glasses. Got on an airplane the next day, flew through San Francisco to visit my college-age daughter on the way home, and she basically said, "Mom, are you sure that you didn't get that disease?" I'm like, "Oh, it'll go. It's not a big deal. They're on it." Fast forward 5 days, and what we were hearing from our team in China was that they were not going to be allowed to return from the Lunar New Year holiday, and that our typical lab reopening, that first or second week of February was not going to happen. So I put a crisis team on the ground immediately, despite the fact that we here in the United States really were still believing this was going to be contained, kind of similar to SARS or MERS or even Ebola, and not really affect us on shore. And in fact, what we started to do as our labs were shutting down in China and our employees were working from home, is we moved a lot of our business to Northern Italy because we are global. We didn't quite expect that Northern Italy was going to be the next region to shut down, but we have been able to largely stay ahead of what's happening. I think a lot of my lessons from this came from some past experiences. I was a management consultant on 9/11, and one of our largest clients was in the World Trade Center, and they were hit hard, and we were hit, and that was difficult as a leader to keep people focused, as one of the leaders of a small consulting firm at the time. And then at USG, my former company, the housing crisis in the US took our demand, which would have been 2 million housing starts, down by 50% in the first year, to 1 million housing starts, down by another 50% to 500,000. So I think the biggest lessons for me in all of those is you can't plan for the crisis coming, but you can immediately get people on the ground and immediately get a plan in place and immediately start communicating and assessing all the new information that's coming at you, and you've got to make quick decisions.
So you used the adjective essential when you were doing your description, but you're technically an essential business, right? Which has meant that you have been able to keep things going. So could you talk a little bit about how that's been to actually have been running through this crisis?
Yeah, it's interesting. When the first issuances, the local counties were starting for us, particularly in California and our labs there, essentially saying shelter in place, work from home unless you're essential. And you start reading the documents, and it was a mishmash. So you have to, again, as a leader, interpret. And as we started reading the documentation, you always have a whole group of people on your team who are, very risk averse. And, the immediate reaction was, well, everything's shut down. I'm like, let's read those documents again. And as you start reading through, I would say 90% of what we test are products that are considered essential. So we test electrical for new ventilators. We test the testing kits for Abbott. We test the fire trucks that are being manufactured in northern Wisconsin. We test, we test the efficacy of the power grid. We test, I mean, you can go on and on and on. So it was very, on one hand, easy for me as a CEO to say, listen, customers have demand. We've got the lab capacity. We can figure out how to socially distance. We're essential. So that was kind of an easy check mark. The difficult check mark was convincing our employees in a time of a crisis who are scared, and legitimately so. When you think about the news that was coming out in early to mid-March, the infection rate was skyrocketing, the death rate was starting to take off around the world. The news in Italy was terrible. The news in Wuhan was getting better, but slowly. And to look your employees in the eye and say, we executives are all working from home, but you need to go to the labs, is a difficult message. And so we had to get very creative very quickly in how to send the message, because I'm a big believer, people go where their leader goes. And so if I wasn't willing to go into the office, if I wasn't willing, to make these tough decisions, how could I expect the rest of the team to do that? And so we did a couple things. We, like I said, we took down everybody who didn't need to be in a lab and removed them. And we did it because it would keep the people who had to go to the lab safer. So instead of feeling that we had, the people who got to stay home and the people who got to go to work, it was, this is for everybody's safety. So we did that. We changed up and helped people, just with little things like, do you need a transportation stipend or a lunch stipend? And just, we got kind of creative around, depending on the location, things that we were offering to employees, not on a permanent basis, but that were making a very difficult time easier. And then we created a communications plan that we called Safety Heroes. And we started sending out every single day a newsletter to all 14,000 employees about some of the work that we were doing somewhere in the world that was essential service supporting this crisis, and highlighting our employees who were those heroes. And it's been a really important message, and it's given, I think, a vast majority of our employees a real sense of pride in the fact that we are essential and what we're doing to keep the world safe in a time where everything feels unsafe.
So within your company, the people who have been working from home, I take it they haven't gone back to work to the office as yet, right? What has the reaction been to working from home? And do you see this as a change in the future or something that we will go back to the normal once things go back to normal?
I think it depends, and it depends on a number of things. I think, so we have gone back in China, and we have gone back in Korea, and to some degree in Japan. And I would say in all of those countries, with the exception of parents who've got kids who are still home from school, they have looked to go back to the office, largely because the internet connections at home, the space that people have to work out of at home, and just that general camaraderie of the way that a lot of our work is done is missing. And so while we were able to keep the business running with people working from home, there's a lot of people who, for a lot of reasons, prefer to be in the office. We just did a survey of most of our locations, most of our leaders around the locations, to get a sense of, do people want to see reduced office space and have more working from home? Because there are some real benefits. It reduces commute times. In a global company, it makes it much easier to have a 6 o'clock phone call with Europe and Singapore in the morning, or a 6 p.m. phone call, again, with somewhere in Asia, that, versus spending 15 hours a day in the office. So it does facilitate teamwork better. But indeed, I would say that where you see what I would call more professional services, self-directed work teams, I do think there will be more of a shift to work from home. and where you see more transactional services, as well as people who just don't have, the nice home office that they can ensconce themselves in, they're going to be looking to go back to the office. So I think what will change is this need for everybody to be doing everything the same way. And I think we'll be able to use technology more appropriately to adapt. We were just talking about, group meetings that we have, and, we'll now have faces on the wall in the meeting and faces in the room socially distanced for the next 6 months. I do think ultimately, having been CEO of a company that was the world's leader in manufacturing drywall, I would love to see everybody have 4 walls around them in offices, because, it's always good.
We hear a lot of talk now about what is the responsibility of the CEO, right? Is it a purely shareholder model? Is it a shared responsibility? Do you have other stakeholders? What is your view on that broadly? And do you think this crisis has changed that in some sense?
It's definitely an interesting topic. Having grown up at University of Chicago when Milton Friedman was there, telling us all as finance majors that the only thing that matters is the shareholder, and that's the job of the CEO. And I will tell you, having been a public company CEO and now being a private company CEO, the shareholder is the #1 thing that matters. There has been this evolution around the full set of stakeholders, and I do think that this crisis, on one hand, will accelerate some of that. I think it's interesting, the towns where you can see the mountains again in the mountain range, or the pollution is down, versus other places where maybe not so much. And I think, while Larry Fink at BlackRock has been saying for the last few years, if you're a public company, that you have to prove your CSR plan, your corporate social responsibility plan. As a CEO of a public company where BlackRock was invested, I was always a little bit of a cynic, like, okay, yeah, that's good and well until it comes time to actually vote on something that's financial. But BlackRock has been a real leader in beating the drum on hey, here's what we expect from you. And they're invested in everybody. So I don't think it's going to go away. And, the beauty of now being in a private company focused on safety, we think this is a real opportunity for us to help set the standards and make sure that the efficacy of CSR plans are actually, as my father, the retired high school football coach, would say, that they're backing up the big talk on Friday night. That if they say that this is their CSR plan, that these are the standards that they're following, and that we've tested the efficacy of those. So I do think it will continue to evolve, and I do think the younger generation, many of our students, your generation is really pushing for this, and isn't going to let my generation off the hook on it.
So you, as a company doing something really critical, you're heavily connected to the local economy, local politics, local regulation. And I know that in Chicago specifically, you have been named personally to the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force, and Crane says that the mayor is leaning on you. What does that mean? What do you see your role as in terms of moving that forward? And is it an individual role, or do you think UL has sort of a role to play in that as well?
Yeah, I think it's both. First, I'll say, don't believe everything you read. I think the mayor is doing a heck of a job, and she's got good judgment. So she's doing well here. But the Economic Recovery Task Force was interesting, and I haven't talked to the mayor specifically about this, but I think this is something that she would have been doing anyway as an execution of her strategy. And, in the words of, you can pick which leader said it first, but don't waste a good crisis. And I think that she's not wasting a good crisis. Chicago has some real challenges as a city. We're the 3rd largest GDP in the country. And over the last 20 years, we've had the slowest growth rate of the top 20 cities. We all know Illinois and Chicago have some real challenges around the finances. It's something that we, the commercial club, have been beating the drum on a regular basis. We got laughed at a few years ago for proposing that we needed a rainy day fund in Illinois, and here we are. We could really use a rainy day fund. So I think the mayor is being really smart in saying, hey, let's get the business leaders together to really talk about not just what it takes to turn the economy back on, but as she's phrased it, what could be the fifth star in Chicago's flag? Where do we really anchor ourselves into the future? And then how do we make appropriate changes as a city and a state? And a couple of real examples of that. The commercial club sponsored, it actually came about maybe 5 years ago when Amazon was doing its headquarters bake-off, and Chicago put together its proposition, and the commercial club was in the center of that response. And they did a ton of great work about how we've got the most diverse technical talent of any city out there. And that we've got, we are first rate when it comes to academic institutions. And then, the number of students who are raring to go. We're in later place when it comes to the people who stay here because, that siren call of the coasts comes in. And so but we're more affordable, and we've got the best transportation, and we've got a freshwater lake that, let me tell you, every time I'm in China, I'm fascinated that, my Chinese colleagues always ask about that deep reserve of fresh water out our front door, which we take for granted, but many parts of the world, being water challenged, view it as a real asset. So, when you put all the pieces together, I heard somebody say, we're a cast of all-stars, but we're not viewed as an all-star cast yet. And so the mayor is really focused on how do we put those pieces together. And the role of the individual companies, I think, is important. I think that one of the great things that Silicon Valley has, and I think it comes from that, being so many companies being funded by, similar overlapping private equity investments, is that they support each other. That, you think about how did Slack get started? Well, Slack was a bunch of gamers who were being funded, and the gaming didn't work out so well, but their PE firm basically said, well, what else do you got? Okay, we've got this collaboration tool, let's go. And then all the other companies that were being funded by that firm started using Slack, and all of a sudden it starts to take off. We need to create that same type of, connectedness and incubator in Chicago. And again, we kind of have it, but this is a real opportunity. And I think that's where the mayor's task force is really going, and the importance of the commercial club's role in that, and the importance of, we as the CEOs who are participating in it. And I kind of feel like on the CEO side, our job is to keep it real, that you can come up with the ideas, but, those who are really the business leaders, Melody Hobson in particular, one of my favorite people, is just poking, make it specific, tell us exactly what you need, make it specific, don't give us, just big headlines. How do we make this specific? Because if it's not specific, it's really hard to make it work. So that, I think it's a great example of this public-private, unification of effort, and I'm excited about what it can result in for the city and for the mayor.
Great. I'm going to go back to something you mentioned about BlackRock and sort of the whole role about big institutional holders, activism, things like that. And you were CEO at USG when you had an unsolicited takeover and you were ultimately acquired. And Warren Buffett was your largest shareholder at that time, right? What was that like, that sort of experience?
I'll tell you, having Warren Buffett, Berkshire, as your largest shareholder is just it's an unparalleled opportunity. You learn a ton. And, people always say, well, what's Warren like? He's exactly what he's like when you see him on TV. But when you find yourself in a situation where, he was a 31, 32% shareholder, our number two shareholder who put forth the unsolicited bid was another 10%. So you have 42% of shareholders kind of unified. But as a CEO, your job is for all shareholders. And so, I had 58% of my shareholders who were not one of those two and were at various points on the spectrum of what they thought we should do. Now, one of the most interesting things about having Berkshire in your stock is there's plenty of other funds out there, probably plenty of funds that plenty of students are interviewing with or going to go to work for, who say, hey, we're just like Buffett. Let me tell you, nobody's like Warren Buffett. And the way you have to think about this is, yeah, you can get into a stock at the same time Berkshire does, but look at their history. How did Berkshire get into USG stock? Berkshire got in, they got in early when USG had declared bankruptcy due to asbestos litigation, and they were willing to take a risk that there was going to be a solution to that, which there was. They got in because they backstopped us as part of that solution, so they took a bigger stake. And then the global financial crisis, housing crisis hit, and there was a cash crunch at USG, and Berkshire took an even bigger stake because they offered us convertible debt. So they gave us $300 million at a 10% coupon rate, which we paid for 5 years, and then converted to USG stock at about $10 a share at a time that our stock was trading, I want to say, in the low to mid 20s. So their financial equation, because of the amount of cash that they have and because of their long-term perspective, is not the same as any other investor who says, oh, I'm going to invest the way Warren invests. And it was a very interesting set of conversations that I had with a number of that 58% of shareholders during these negotiations, because we were holding out for more money than was being offered. And Berkshire publicly went on record that they were happy with $42 a share. And our board and I were not happy with $42 a share. And there was a fair number of my 58% or 48% of remaining shareholders, 58% of remaining shareholders who were not going to be happy with $42 a share. So I had to walk an interesting tightrope of making sure that I was addressing all shareholders' needs, not just the largest, most famous shareholder in the world, who was a terrific shareholder. So it was a really interesting learning experience, like nothing I ever expected.
Now, do you as a new CEO worry about activists, hostile takeovers, things like that? Sort of how much time do you spend thinking about it? What's your perspective on all of that?
Yeah, I'll tell you. So as a public company CEO, as a new CEO, it's the number one thing you have to worry about. As I was evaluating my next chapter when I was leaving USG, one of the things that I interviewed and thought about a number of public companies, and then UL is private. And but I would tell you, even in a private company, and we have one shareholder, which is a not-for-profit that founded us. You can't ever assume that your shareholder is happy, and you can't ever assume that there aren't others talking to your shareholder about how things could be better if they were the owner. And I think that that's what when you're a brand new CEO of a public company, you have to assume that the activists are in there talking to other shareholders on a regular basis. Madhav, we didn't mention, I serve on Norfolk Southern Corporation, one of the large Class 1 railroad boards. And Jim Squires, the CEO, who's also a U of C law school alum, I think he was 3 months onto the job, maybe less, when he had CSX and Bill Ackman take a run on him. And they withstood. They decided to hold firm and not sell. But it was, again, as a new CEO, tossed right in, as I say, right into the deep end, and you learn to paddle pretty quickly. And it was actually helpful for me. I wasn't, I had just joined Norfolk's board when when my unsolicited offer came in, and it was nice to follow and see how Jim had reacted and decisions that were made. So you can learn a lot from each other in this too.
I'm going to mention this because you talked about the commercial club. You recently became chairman of the commercial club, the first female chair in the club's history, almost 150-year history. And of course, you were the first female CEO of USG before, and now UL. What do these first mean to you?
Yeah. It's interesting because it's easy to get frustrated and say, are you kidding me? It took 143 years to, name a female as chair. Or, at USG, 115 years to name a female as CEO, or at UL, 126 years. But I look at it as it's a real honor and a real opportunity. And I think that there's so many strong female leaders out there, both who are CEOs and who are leaders in, the next layer down in organizations. And I think that the opportunity to be that role model for women all over the world is just a terrific opportunity for me. But I do also say, it was one of the things that I loved about my tenure at Notre Dame. I think, Madhav, you and I talked about this, that Father Hesburgh was president of Notre Dame when I was there. And he was the one who made the decision to let women into the University of Notre Dame in 1972 as full-time students. And I started Notre Dame in 1984. I thought, 12 years had passed. I was 17 when I started undergrad. That was a lifetime, 12 years. I mean, whole lifetime had passed in my mind. And once I got there, I realized that no, for a lot of people here, 12 years wasn't that long. But what I always hung my hat on, and I think what most of my Notre Dame friends have hung our hat on in being there, was Father Ted's rationale for admitting women was you can't leave out any of the world's thinkers and believe you can be a great institution. And I think that's the neat part about just being a leader in general. And it leads to my whole philosophy on diversity and inclusion. You can't leave out any of the world's thinkers and think you can be a great institution. So that's where, I'm most excited about some of these firsts, is just to continue the advancement of diversity and inclusion and of thought and background and gender and everything else in everything that we do.
Okay. So I'm going to turn it to Julie now to bring up some questions from the audience. And then if I have time, I'll come back with a couple of questions of my own.
Great.
Julie?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jenny. That was fun. That was great. There have been a couple of comments, Jenny, about I'm going to start on the technical side of things, about which I know nothing, but there have been a couple of comments about your microphone. And I think if you sit further back, it's a little bit better.
Further back. Okay.
It gets echoey when you sit closer up. So we can get it that way. That's my technical diagnosis of the issue, which is dangerous. There have been a couple of questions that have come in around the topic of innovation. And so I'd love to get your views on what kinds of expectations do you have around innovation? How do you think about innovation with regard to UL?
Yeah, I think innovation is the lifeblood in anything that we do. First of all, innovation drives demand for us, because as companies are innovating new products, those products need to be tested for safety. So just in general, staying up with innovation and the latest topics is essential. The other key pieces of innovation really come from both advancements in productivity, and then we think about kind of innovation as, the necessity is the mother of invention. This crisis has presented a lot of cases of necessity, and I'll give you a perfect example of one of them. Roughly 25% of our revenue comes from inspecting actual manufacturing plants. So once you get the red UL mark on a product, we still need to inspect 4 times a year that what's happening in the manufacturing facility matches what those standards and safety specifications are. Enter COVID, nobody wants strangers in their plants. So we very quickly came up with a methodology where we could virtually inspect using cell phones, using the content management databases that we had, taking pictures, interacting in a very different way. And then, immediately had to take that innovation to OSHA, because they monitor a lot of this, and convince them that there was going to be efficacy in doing this. That took real innovation. Now, I joke with my team that this is something that we were considering and should have been doing anyway, but we would have hired armies of consultants and spent 2 years and interviewed customers and debated all sorts of ways that we should do this, and had lots of risk arguments and lots of reasons why it wouldn't work. And instead we just did it. And that's the beauty, I think, of a crisis, And then I think that mindset needs to be the ongoing mindset around innovation into the future. And I think that this crisis will lead to a step change in a lot of innovation in a lot of different areas.
So that's actually a nice segue to the next question. When you and Madhav were talking, you talked about kicking off a strategy refresh at UL when you joined, and how has that progressed? How much has the current crisis derailed that, or how much has it really become an integral part of that strategy?
Yeah, it's interesting. In a crisis, you learn a lot about people. As a background, I'm always a big believer in the strengths finders that, the Gallup survey poll of play to your strengths. And one of the things I like about it is that under stress, people revert to their core strengths and their core behaviors. So as a leader under stress, I'm seeing a lot of, reversion to those deep habits and those deep behaviors. And I would tell you, there's absolutely two camps in our organization. There's the school that says, don't waste a crisis. We have got to accelerate our strategy because our competitors aren't sitting still. And so, yes, we're all on the phone 12, 14 hours a day. We're all trying to keep up with shifting demand and what the heck is going on with our customers and our employees. But we've got to keep moving on how do we improve our focus on our customers and reduce our bureaucracy and rationalize our portfolio and do all those other things that are, clear parts of the strategy. And then there's some people who basically, are saying, well, we don't have time to walk and chew gum. Like, oh, yes, we do. So you learn a lot. But I think if you're at a company that's not using this time of crisis to figure out how you're going to improve coming out of the crisis, you are wasting time and you are going to be left in the dust when this whole thing comes back.
The next question pertains to sustainability tech. UL acquired Credit 360 a couple of years ago for sustainability reporting. How are you working? So can you comment on the growth of a product for the US market where sustainability reporting is not mandated yet?
Right.
Is sustainability tech a high priority for you?
It is. I love that product. So for those of you who don't know what it is, this is a business we acquired in Cambridge, England, and it's really focused on, again, that sustainability reporting. So, let's take the BlackRock example where they want to know what the corporate sustainability strategy plan is, and then they want to start seeing results. And even if you're not publicly traded, there are many countries, particularly starting in the EU, but we believe we're going to see this across the US, as smaller companies, to get bank loans or to get, any type of, listing from the SEC or anything, you're going to have some type of sustainability report. So the cool thing about Credit 360 is that it's a nice way for, I would say, mid-tier companies to load in their data early, create that report, and then we help them keep it updated on an ongoing basis. And given that it's our job to pay attention to what are the standards, what are the different scientific criteria, we're the natural fit to keep that information updated and keep our clients apprised of what else they might need to add to it in order to meet the requirements without making it, an extra department or, an abusive professional fee structure of some larger company to help them on an annual basis on this. So we're pretty excited about it. I think it's great growth.
Where do you see the real technological opportunities in terms of supply chain, logistics, as well as manufacturing?
So you mean outside of UL? Or yeah, I'll tell you, supply chains are going to shift. They are shifting already. They were shifting prior to this pandemic, and they're shifting for a couple of reasons. They're shifting, one, just because of the tariffs that have been put in place. And what you see is a lot of companies moving their assembly lines outside of China. And but it's hard to move the core components. where the raw materials are tend to be the cheapest place to actually make those components. But you can ship that assembly, avoid tariffs, and move your manufacturing. So already supply chains are shifting. The second thing that you're going to see happening is traceability in supply chains. That back to the sustainability, there's going to be a bigger push for people not just to know where the product came from prior to landing, but where all of the pieces of that product came from. So traceability of supply chains is a hot topic. It's something that started, here in the U.S., even around conflict minerals reporting. It's an SEC requirement that came about, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. But you're going to see more and more of that. So I think those are, probably the hottest area right now is just advancements, changes, and efficacy of supply chains. I also think companies are going to want to be much more comfortable that their supply chain is not single sourced and that future crises aren't going to put their business at tremendous risk, that they've got degrees of freedom around where they source.
Questions are flying in and they are wide ranging, which is kind of fun. So small and medium businesses have been disproportionately affected by COVID. Do large and established firms with solid balance sheet have a responsibility to help smaller businesses in this climate?
Well, it's an interesting definition of responsibility. I think certainly we should all be very smart about back on our supply chains and where are those small and medium businesses who've been supporting us and finding ways, do you extend payment terms or do you throw more business at them? I think that, clearly, what's good business should be good business, and giving the nod to a lot of these smaller companies is essential. I think, the question is, on the other side of the responsibility is, as government loans are out there, as the government is paying for this, there will be a trickle-down effect. We as large businesses, I think we all fully expect that there will be a tax bill coming our way in some way, shape, or form that we're going to have to foot the bill for. So I definitely think we're going to end up bearing the responsibility for some of that. But when I really think about, UL has 90,000 customers. Everybody's heard of our top 1,000. Nobody's heard of our bottom 85,000. So we have a large number of customers who are those small businesses who are making different components that are going into larger portions of the supply chain. And, we've been fortunate that most of our customers seem to be faring pretty well, but there are some really, disheartening stories out there. And I think as much as we all can be out there, I think back to post 9/11 of President Bush basically saying, what can we do? Get out there and go shopping. I mean, order food, send your dry cleaning in, get your car fixed, all those things that you need to do on a daily basis anyway to help those small businesses. It's pretty essential.
There's a couple of questions that have come in that are a little bit more personal in nature. So as a CEO, how do you keep current in a world of infinite content?
I'm a big reader. I read a lot. I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't have time for it. My husband would watch a movie every single night of his life. He loves the theater. And I'm like, I'll read a book. First thing I do, I get up in the morning, I read the Wall Street Journal, I skim the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times. Just, you got to know the headlines. And then I've just got, different sources within the company and outside of the company of people sending me things, and you sift through it all. And then through travel, you just got to get out there and learn.
Another more personal related question. If you were in a position to change anything about your career, what would you change? Would you get more or less education? Would you have taken more risks? What would you have done differently?
It's funny. It's one of those questions because I think things turned out okay, but I do joke. There's probably, two things. a couple of pivotal moments. You know, one, I almost went to law school, and I would not change the fact that I did not go to law school, although there's times that it would have come in handy to have a law degree, because I think it's a good discipline to know, but I don't regret that choice. When I was an undergrad, I started out as a math major, and in retrospect, and then I shifted over and minored in computer applications. I took most of my math credits and moved over to that. And that was, you know, in the mid 80s. And ended up majoring in government and international relations, again, because I thought I was going to go to law school, so it seemed to make sense. In retrospect, sometimes I say I should have been an engineer. You know, I think like an engineer. I'm an engineer at heart. I am a math science person. I enjoy engineering topics. And so I always wonder, you know, back then, there weren't many female engineers. There still aren't. In fact, there are fewer today, I think, than there were when I was in college, which is always surprising to me. But I do always wonder, like, maybe I should have been an engineer. And then I was like, but it turned out okay.
Turned out okay.
The other interesting piece that my husband and I play the what if on a lot is, what if we had left Chicago? We both thought a lot about going to Silicon Valley in the early 90s before we had kids. After I finished U of C and he finished his MBA. And I always thought I would leave Chicago. And I'd love to travel the world. I did not think I would spend my whole career in Chicago. And so, you know, it like I say, it turned out okay, but that's always in the back of my mind, like, what if I had gone to Silicon Valley in 1993?
As you said, it turned out pretty well. I'm going back to more business related questions, but there's a fun question to end with as well that's more personal. So what services and segments will UL be looking at to invest in and prioritize for profitable growth going forward?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting elements, you know, back to technology is you got to understand, you got to follow your customers, and you got to understand what your strengths are. And our strengths, you know, in fire, life, and health safety. And when you look at that, some of our deepest expertise is in battery technology and in human factors engineering. And so you think about what is the confluence of those two things right now, and it's electric and autonomous vehicles. And that's not been an area, automotive has not been a big area for UL in the past. Automotive has been, you know, again, if you're in wire and cable and you're supplying components into an automobile, we test for you, but we've never gone big into auto. But I think for us, it's something that we naturally right now believe that our core strengths and our customers are a perfect fit for investing in that as a growth area. The second place that we're looking is, again, we've typically focused our energies on testing products in a lab, testing components, testing products. Getting into that supply chain, we're going to be moving really in two directions. Is how are those products used out in the field? So, for example, not just testing the components that might be in a wind turbine, but actually testing that wind turbine out in the field. And we've got some involvement in that. And similarly, testing the raw, you know, back down that supply chain and making sure that we really understand and can help our customers understand what ended up in their products. So kind of deepening it in both ends of the product, and then also weaving together how our strengths fit into new technologies.
What traits do you feel are especially valuable to you these days in the C-suite? Which traits have really helped you advance in your journey and you are ones that you rely on today?
It's interesting. I've been told both when we were going through the takeover at UFG by a number of my colleagues, and also during this crisis, is that I am pretty even-keeled. And I believe that you can't let your emotions get the best of you in stressful times. I said it before, people go where their leader goes. And if you're mercurial, if you're chaotic, people will behave that way. So I do think, you know, that just the strength and staying calm is important. But I always say to people, do not confuse the fact that I'm calm and polite with being nice, because those are two very different things. And you have to make some really tough decisions in crises. And they're not always nice decisions. And it is what it is. You're the leader, you got to make those. And so I think, being very rational, explaining to people, communicating frequently, those are all things that I naturally do. And I think that they play well in a time of crisis. So those are probably the big ones.
Yeah, those are pretty important ones. As the CEO of a private company, do you feel that you can plan and invest longer term than you could as the CEO of a public company?
I always felt in the public company that we were planning for a longer horizon. You just had to explain it every quarter. So the difference is how often you have to explain it and how often you have to defend it. But I don't think it changes the horizon. You have to have, I think, a tougher skin as a public company CEO, because people are constantly going to poke holes. And if, in a given quarter, that long-term plan doesn't appear to be playing out, you can get, put in the hot seat and under a lot of pressure. But I also think as a public company CEO, if you don't have that long-term plan, if you're not giving shareholders that long-term narrative, you're really in trouble, because they won't let you survive 2 bad quarters. Whereas if you're really laying out the rationale for that strategic narrative, while they won't all be happy about it, they'll at least, for the most part, support you on it.
And then finally, before I turn it back over to Madhav, will you share a favorite memory of your time as a Booth student?
So I was in the evening program, and we didn't always have the opportunity to form deep relationships. So I have a couple ones that really stand out for me because they did form deep relationships. And the one that I will always remember was in negotiations class, and we had to have the group project around, basically coming up with the BATNA, coming up with what did we really believe the net present value of the negotiation at hand was, and how we were going to prove that. And we decided as a group to go to different health clubs. I was at the time where Bally's Fitness was the big popular one, and we basically went in posing as different characters, because these health clubs were all over Chicago. And we posed as a newlywed couple, or we posed as the young girl who just got her first nursing job, and we posed we did all these different personas, and basically proved that Bally's was going to get $1,200 out of us. It didn't matter how hard we negotiated. It didn't matter what their opening bid was. We negotiated and we got $1,200. It was what the contract, and then we'd walk out and not sign it. And it was a lot of fun. And what it really taught me was, even, for people when you're, when you don't see each other every day like you would in a full-time program, and even whereas classes get mixed, when you've got those opportunities to come together and really have a common, grounding and a common purpose, you can get a lot done in a short period of time. And that's what I always felt like was the benefit of being in the evening program, the 190 program, we called it back then, that you could form some quick relationships and, formulate around a common cause and get some great results in a fun way.
So it sounds like even though your husband might be the TV and theater buff in the family, you have had a stint at acting and all of that. Madhav, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question. It's more not a question. It's something we talked about last time we spoke, and you had a very interesting way of thinking about COVID and the risks of COVID. And I'm sure you know what I mean. I mean, if you could say that, I think the audience would find that very thought-provoking. I certainly did.
Yeah, I was telling Madhav that I write an email to all 14,500 employees every Monday, and it's been a great way for them to get to know me as a new CEO. And this last week, I really got thinking about it. I've been reading just a lot about perceived risk and real risk. And what's interesting is that as humans, we perceive the risk of what's exactly in front of us as being much greater than the risks that are farther out there. And when you look at the way that the numbers are playing out, and you look at the dangers and the risks associated with this current virus, and you compare those to some other risks, those risks are very similar. And the one that I've kind of anchored on is, you know, the risk of getting in a car every day. We willingly get behind the wheel of a car, and we've adapted to a new normal around that. We wear seatbelts, we follow speed limits, we make sure that pedestrians walk in crosswalks. We, you know, willingly put limits on ourselves while we're in a car to keep ourselves and others safe. And I think in a time like this where I don't, you know, I believe in science, and I don't believe that a vaccine is coming this summer. I think we'll be fortunate to get one in 2021. And I think when you even look at, you know, how quickly can you roll that out to a world population of 7 billion? And I think when I think about my 250,000 miles a year I typically travel, we all have to sign up willingly for risks. And we need to protect that what needs to be protected. We need to protect the medical community and make sure that they're there and able to take care of everybody who needs to be taken care of. And we need to protect the most vulnerable, you know, both, you know, those who are in the broader society as well as those who work for us. I have plenty of employees who are in an older population or an at-risk population that we need to figure out the right way to protect them. And then the rest of us need to learn to take the same type of risks that we take every single time that we get in a car or get on an airplane or do any of those other, you know, risky propositions in life that we've learned to make trade-offs on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny, for coming, and thank you for the insightful comments and for answering all of the questions that came up so candidly and directly. Again, it's wonderful to have you as an alum in such an important role, and thank you for everything that you do for the school.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Jenny.